Welcome to the next podcast with Jay Cookingham, a heartfelt journey through grief, loss, and healing. After the devastating loss of his wife, Christine, Jay shares his raw, honest reflections on navigating life without her. This podcast explores the power of grief as a medicine that teaches resilience, invites lament, and leads us to discover God's presence during sorrow. With grace and vulnerability, Jay offers hope and encouragement to those walking through grief, reminding us that we're not alone on this journey of healing.
Hello, and welcome back to the next podcast, where we have conversations about navigating, embracing, exploring, and ultimately learning to trust as we journey forward through grief and loss. I'm your host, Jay Cookingham, and as always, I am thankful that you're here. Today, we're going to continue our journey through the next acronym with the word embrace, finding purpose in pain and acknowledging grief without letting it define us. In episode 17, we started this series by talking about navigate, how we find our way through loss and uncertainty. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, I encourage you to go back and check it out, as it sets the stage for what we're diving into today. Now, you might wonder why embrace comes before explore in the next framework. Of course, it fits the acronym better, but it's more than that to me. Normally, we try to explore our emotions before we accept them. We want to understand what we're feeling before we embrace them. That makes sense. But in grief, things don't always work that way. It is never that neat or tidy. This isn't an expert suggestion. It's a experiential one. I've walked through the messy parts of grief where understanding wasn't possible at that moment. What I needed most in those times wasn't an answer. It was permission to feel, to express, and embrace what was happening inside of me. For me, understanding the why came later. I needed to purge before I understood why. That's why the next framework isn't a strict step-by-step process. It's a fluid way to navigate grief. Some days you will need to navigate, other days you'll need to trust. And often you'll find yourself embracing and exploring all at once. And that's okay. The goal isn't to follow a perfect order, but the goal is to keep moving forward, focusing on the next step. So, embrace. What does that really mean? Here's my simple definition, or the way I like to look at it, or the way I like to describe it. Maybe you'll connect with my thoughts. Maybe you'll think I'm just a crazy man. I'm okay with either, or both. But to embrace is to fully acknowledge and accept the reality of grief and loss, without letting it consume or define you. Embracing pain means giving yourself permission to fully feel and experience grief, not suppressing it or running away from it, but allowing it to be present even when it's uncomfortable. It's not about holding on to pain, but it's more about surrendering it to God and trusting that He can bring purpose from it. To embrace is a choice, of course. To feel every emotion without shame, to learn from pain without being imprisoned by it, and to move forward with faith, hope, and trust in God's goodness. It's all a choice. And that's what I mean when I use the word embrace. And here's the thing. I think grief shapes us, but it doesn't have to define us. It doesn't have to define us unless we let it. Grief is natural and it's necessary. It's how we process loss. It's unavoidable. None of us are going to be exempt from it. But if we're not careful, grief can become something more than just an experience that we're walking through. Become the lens through which we see ourselves and everything and everyone else. We could start to believe that we are forever broken, forever defined by what we have lost. I know this battle all too well. I'm 5 years into it so far. Every day since my bride died, I had to come face to face with my own loss, to fully acknowledge the depth of it, the weight of it. But I also had to guard against the temptation to let it tell me who I was, to let it define me. My brokenness tried to convince me that my pain had no purpose, that this was all I'll ever be from now on. I will be a widower. But God, thank God he did, spoke a different word over my life. He reminded me that, yes, he makes all things new. He also reminded me that my pain, while it may shape me, but it does not own me. I can learn how to own my own pain and find purpose in it. My thought is this: I will not let this season define me, but I will let it refine me. I've repeated that phrase many times. It has become a declaration of trust for me. I believe that this statement acknowledges the reality of my grief, but I also refuse to let my pain have the final word. It shifts the focus from being a victim of pain to being transformed by it. That's what embracing grief in a healthy way looks like to me. Not ignoring it, not pretending that it doesn't hurt, because it does, but choosing to believe that our pain is not the end of the story, and that there is purpose in our pain, even though we may not see it yet. What has helped me embrace my pain is the thought about using it as a fuel source. Kenji Miyawanza said this about pain: we must embrace pain and burn it as fuel for our journey. Using pain as fuel for the journey of grief means redirecting that energy of loss and sorrow and struggle into something purposeful, rather than allowing it to consume or control you. I know it sounds strange, using pain as fuel, but here's the truth. Whether we realize it or not, our pain is already fueling something. The question is what? Maybe it's fueling anger. Maybe it's making us withdraw or make us silent. Maybe it's robbing us of hope, convincing us that joy is something we'll never experience again. The truth is, we're already using it as fuel. Pain will either drive us towards anger or bitterness and despair, or it can push us towards healing, purpose, and connection. The choice isn't whether pain will affect us, it's how we will let it. How are we burning through it? These are huge questions to ask ourselves as we process our grief. The good news is we can make a different choice. We can decide to direct our pain instead of being controlled by it. We can give it a purpose. Instead of letting grief lock us into a cycle of despair, we can use it to become the very thing that pushes us forward. Here's where it gets very personal for me. I'm being transparent and as real as I can be here. There are days where I don't see the purpose in my grief, where the loss of my wife feels like a weight too heavy for me to carry. There are many days where I see the pain in my children's eyes, and that cuts me so deep that I can't find the words to express my pain. Yes, there are lots of moments when I still struggle to believe that God could bring good out of this mess. But then I remember Jesus. If anyone understood how to use pain for a greater purpose, it was him. He embraced suffering in a way that changed everything for me, especially how I was handling my own pain. You see, Jesus was never dominated by it. He understood the purpose in his suffering. And if I want to walk in his footsteps and be like Jesus, then I must believe that my pain can lead to something greater too. So I believe embracing pain as a fuel source places me at the helm. Maybe only as a co-pilot, maybe fighting for the control of the wheel, but now I have choices to give up or to go on. I choose to go on. I choose to go forward, and so can you. Psalm 13, verses 5 through 6 says a beautiful promise. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. And that's a promise, and that's too is my choice. I don't trust in my feelings or in my pain. I trust in the goodness of my Father to bring purpose out of my suffering. I will worship and be grateful even when I'm hurting and suffering. This attitude helps me use worship to burn pain as fuel. One of the most powerful things I've learned and I'm still learning on this journey is that worship and grief are not opposite or in conflict with each other. They are so deeply connected. Some of my rawest, most honest moments of worship have come when I've been at my lowest, when my prayers were whispered through tears, when my voice shook under the weight of my sorrow. Man, that was worship. That was lament. That was worship at the purest form. This is where sorrow and joy mix. This is biblical lament, which is all so sacred to me. And I realized something along the way, that worship challenges me to grieve better. Grief has a language. It has a voice. It cries out. It groans. It demands to be heard. And for a long time, I let my pain speak loudly. I wept loudly. I questioned loudly. I wrestled with God, with fierceness. But then I had to ask myself, if I was that loud in my pain, shouldn't I also be loud in my praise? Worship isn't about ignoring the pain. It's about declaring who God is in the pain. It's not pretending that everything is okay and nothing hurts. It's about offering God my broken hallelujahs, trusting that He is still good, even when life isn't. Now, I don't believe my wife died so I can learn valuable life lessons. I don't think God orchestrated this loss to teach me something. But I do believe, and I do choose to trust, that God is using my pain and my grief to teach me valuable lessons of grace, lessons of compassion and resilience. Now, that trust didn't come easily. I walked squarely, directly in the path of my grief. I didn't run from it. I dove in and wrestled with God there. Like I said, sometimes very fiercely. My fists were clenched. My heart was raw, and I demanded answers. But eventually, my wrestling turned into surrender. It turned into loving and worshiping Him there in the crater of my pain. And there, in that very place that I thought I was too broken ever to be whole again, I found grace. I found grace to move out of the crater and towards my future. Grace to trust that my story isn't over. Grace to believe that even in my deepest sorrow, God is still writing something good in my story. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6:12, I will not be dominated by anything. And for me, that includes grief. That includes sorrow. Worship helps me remember that grief does not own me. God owns me. And in those moments when I choose to worship, even when I don't feel like it, I begin to see the way forward. Not because my grief disappears, but because I'm no longer carrying it alone. Jesus walks with me in my sorrow, and He walks with you too. I know what it feels like to be swallowed up by sorrow. I still have those days of deep sorrow. And that's not a bad thing. Sorrow isn't the enemy. But I also know that sorrow doesn't have to imprison me. I know that there are steps to take, not to embrace the pain, but keep it from defining who we are. So this is how I see someone using pain as fuel in their grief journey. Number one, they acknowledge pain instead of avoiding it. Instead of numbing, suppressing, or ignoring grief, they face it head on. They allow themselves to feel, process, and express their emotions honestly. Number two, they reframe pain as a teacher, not as an enemy. Grief brings deep reflection. These people ask, what is my pain revealing about my heart, my faith, and my purpose? Instead of seeing grief as something that only hurts, they see it as something that can shape them, that they can learn from. Number three, they choose purpose over paralysis. Pain has momentum. It can either keep you stuck or push you forward. They take small intentional steps forward, even when it's hard. That might mean seeking counseling, deepening their faith, or stepping into a calling that's birthed from their pain. Number four, they turn their pain into compassion for others. They recognize that pain isolates, but sharing their journey can connect and heal. They use what they've learned to encourage, comfort, and walk alongside others who are grieving. And number five, they use worship to shift their perspective. Worship becomes a declaration of trust, a way to redirect sorrow into surrender. They don't just grieve loudly, they praise loudly, reminding themselves that God is still writing their story and still worthy of praise. Here's something else I would like you to think about. Worshiping God during grief doesn't mean forgetting those we've lost. It means that we carry their memory with hope instead of despair. It means that we allow their legacy to be part of our journey without keeping us stuck. Jesus is the way forward, and He walks with us even in our sorrow. Thank you for joining me today on the next podcast. I hope this episode has encouraged you and given you some tools to help navigate your journey. If this episode resonated with you, please leave a comment or review. It helps me so much to grow this podcast. And share it with someone who might need hope today. Remember, God is good. God is always good. He always answers out of His goodness. Learning to trust His definition of good is key to moving forward. God bless you, and I'll see you next time on the next podcast.